Welcome to This Explainer, where we are impartially unpacking a truly massive and, let's be honest, sometimes sensitive theological debate. We're looking at a question that impacts practically every churchgoer today. Should pastors teach the 10% tithe as a binding moral obligation? It's a topic that touches on everything from church budgets to our fundamental understanding of biblical covenants and New Testament freedom. Okay, let's take a really quick look at our roadmap. We're going to cover the 10% question, the origins of the tithe, temple taxation, the new covenant shift, the tension between freedom and moral formation, and finally, how to teach generosity today.
So, Section 1, the 10% question, navigating church expectations.
Across so many churches today, the 10% standard, often backed up by quoting passages like Malachi 3, is presented as a binding expectation for believers to fund ministry. But this sparks a pretty intense debate. Should pastors actually teach tithing as a moral obligation? The core tension is this: does demanding a fixed percentage subtly undermine new covenant grace? Or, on the flip side, does abandoning that 10% benchmark cause biblical generosity to completely collapse?
Let's get into Section 2, origins of the tithe, a trans-covenantal principle.
To understand the pro-tithe perspective, we're looking at the work of Old Testament scholar Dr. Ananya Rao. She argues that the tithe isn't just an obsolete Levitical tax, but actually a timeless moral pattern. And if you look at the history, you can see why she says this. Well before the Mosaic law was ever established at Sinai, Abraham gives a tenth of his spoils to Melchizedek in Genesis 14. Later, Jacob vows a tenth to God in Genesis 28. Because these events happen in the pre-law era, Dr. Rao suggests the tithe reflects a foundational recognition of divine ownership that transcends the Old Covenant. Dr. Rao points out that in the ancient world, covenant faithfulness involved real, tangible expressions of loyalty within what scholar John Walton calls a patronal framework. Basically, the tithe functioned as structured gratitude. Just as the Sabbath principle informs Christian rest without forcing us back under the strict Mosaic code, Rao argues the tithe acts as moral formation. It disciplines the human heart against self-sufficiency and provides a biblically coherent benchmark, which echoes Paul's call in 1 Corinthians for believers to set aside resources in keeping with their income. Moving to Section 3, Temple Taxation and Theocracy, the Historical Reality of Israel.
Now, pivoting to the other side of this debate, we have New Testament theologian Dr. Bo Whitaker and biblical scholar Michael Heiser. They ask us to look closely at the historical reality of ancient Israel. They point out that Israel was a very specific theocracy, and in that geopolitical system, the Israelite tithe essentially functioned as a mandatory state tax tied to land inheritance. Its purpose? To maintain the priests and keep the literal temple operations running.
So under this Old Testament theocracy, those strict percentage tithes were absolutely required to support the Levites and the physical temple. But here's the kicker. Once that building was destroyed and Israel lost its political autonomy in the post-temple era, that specific, geographic, land-based taxation structure completely dissolved right along with it. As Heiser emphasizes here, the modern church is simply not a geopolitical nation. We do not have a Levitical class to sustain in that same way, which, according to this view, renders a strict percentage taxation system historically obsolete for the modern believer. Which brings us to Section 4, the new covenant shift, from physical temple to believers. To fully grasp Dr. Whitaker's argument, we really have to recognize a massive paradigm shift. Under the Old Covenant, God's glory dwelt in a literal, physical temple, and it was served by an elite priestly class. But look at the New Covenant. The believer's body is now the temple, and all believers are considered priests. New Testament temple talk completely transforms the literal building into the collective body of believers, which permanently removes the need for literal temple maintenance taxes. So how exactly did the early church handle giving? Well, Dr. Whitaker points out that the apostolic church never commands a tithe. Looking at Paul's words right here in 2 Corinthians, he explicitly says giving must not be under compulsion. The Greek term Paul uses there is incredibly strong. It actively resists any sort of obligation language. Instead, giving is grounded in Christ's self-giving grace, not a rigid mathematical formula. Section 5, Freedom versus Moral Formation, the heart of the debate. Weighing these two compelling perspectives impartially brings us to the absolute core of the debate. On one hand, you have Dr. Rao warning of a very real pastoral danger. Without a fixed 10% benchmark, giving becomes entirely subjective. And let's face it, human nature often means generosity just collapses without structure. On the other hand, Dr. Whitaker cautions that preaching 10% as obligatory subtly pushes believers back toward a law-defined righteousness. It can make those who give less feel disobedient, fundamentally confusing law and gospel. Furthermore, scholars like N.C. Wright highlight an important theological baseline for the side of the debate. He emphasizes that our Christian financial ethics must flow directly from our participation and union with Jesus the Messiah. It shouldn't come from reviving ancient legal codes and applying them where they just don't naturally belong.
Section 6. Teaching Generosity Today, Grace-Led Giving.
So practically speaking, how should pastors navigate this today without reintroducing the law? While even without strict percentage mandates, Heiser and Whitaker outline clear New Testament principles. Believers are taught that the laborer is worthy of his hire, meaning we absolutely must support gospel workers. We are commanded to give cheerfully and without compulsion. We're called to practice sacrificial giving, and we see the early church actively taking up collections to support the poor and sister churches in need.
As Michael Heiser so bluntly puts it, it's not about a certain percentage. You should contribute and give what you can. You know what sacrificial is. The New Testament basically leaves the mathematics up to the believer. It swaps out a rigid theocratic taxation structure for something that is far deeper, a profound, personal, spirit-led responsibility to be radically generous.
So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought regarding your own stewardship. If your giving is no longer measured by a strict 10% law, does your new covenant freedom lead you to be radically more generous? Or, if we're being honest, is it subtly becoming an excuse to hold back? Think about that. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.